Shalom, Bruchim Abayim, and welcome to Shevi'im Panim LaTorah, to the 70 phases of the Torah and also Sulam Yaakov. This week's Torah portion is Parashat Chuqat. The word Chuqat in Hebrew, it means decrees. In the singular, we would call it a chok. I explained many times in previous teachings that the Taryag mitzvot, that we call the 613 commandments, they're divided between two different categories. We have the category of what's called mishpatim, or a mishpat. The literal translation of that would be judgments or a judgment, right? However, we actually refer to them as ordinances. And these would refer to mitzvot that make logical sense, right? When a person hears them, even if they don't make sense right off the cuff, when they go over them a second time, it usually registers with them. The second classification or category of the 613 commandments is what we call chukim. And the chukim or decrees are based upon the mitzvot that don't make logical sense, which means a person can probably study them over 100 times until they're blue in the face, and they still cannot wrap their mind around what this actual mitzvah is. And in fact, this week's Torah portion of Chuqat, we do encounter one of those, what I like to call illogical mitzvahs, and that is the mitzvah of the Parah Adumah, which is known as the red heifer. And as we'll go through this lesson here, one of the things that we see in the Torah is that if a person contracts Tumah, impurity, which once again is impervious to physical senses, it's something that's not physical, it's not a bacteria, rather it's spiritual, it's actually a form of energy, a negative energy. And there's different degrees of Tumah that a person can contract. First degree, second degree, third degree, etc. Rabbinically is called the Av Tumah, which is the primary source, literally means the father. And then there's second or third, basically different degrees of Tumah that come after that. But nonetheless, an individual who comes in contact with a dead corpse, something called Tumat Met, and they're able to contract Tumah, even if they don't physically touch the body, but they enter into an ohel, which is the tent, or let's say a house. They're in some type of proximity without even physically touching the dead corpse. They can contract this Tumah, this impurity. And so what we see here is that in order for them to be purified, they have to go through a purification. Some will call it a ritual, but there's a process in which a Parah Adumah, a red heifer, is basically slaughtered. The ashes of it is used to sprinkle with water over the individual who's contracted the Tumah. And the individual who has to do this procedure is none other than, let's say, the Kohen HaGadol. And the Kohen is described being in a state of purity, right? However, in the exchange or in the process of purifying the individual who's become impure via a dead corpse, the Kohen also becomes tamei. He contracts a form of impurity. Now, it's mind-blowing when you think about this, because as I'll discuss as we go through this teaching, is that we see through the Torah, there are many times in which if a person does, let's say, an inadvertent sin, a chatat, right? They bring a chatat offering. They go to the temple, and never, in any situation, does the Kohen who is involved after the whole shechita process with throwing the blood on the altar and putting the choice fats and organs on the fires of the altar, never in that situation does the Kohen contract Tumah, right? And so we also see that an individual who, let's say, committed asham or committed a chatat, these individuals, if they had to be purified, they go into a mikvah, right? And then there's sprinkle and purification business. And then afterwards, they're considered tahor, they're considered pure. And so this is an area of the Torah that doesn't make logical sense. But because it is a decree from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, a decree from the king, it doesn't always have to make logical sense. It's just a basically command that we are meant to follow, that we should put our logic to the side and should have complete emunah, betachon, faith and trust in Hashem, that his decrees are 100% correct. And so the Torah is divided into these two different classification and commandments, which also separate between what we know positive and negative mitzvot that make up the 613, 248 positive and 365 negative. And so I have subtitled this teaching, The Tragedy of the Human Condition. And this is actually part one. It's a two-part teaching. And the reason why I call it the tragedy of the human condition is because what we learn from this week's Torah portion is a very valuable lesson when it comes to our purpose in this world. And so in this week's Torah portion, as we learn about the mitzvah of Parah Adumah, once again, we see that the primary focus of this mitzvah is to be introduced to purify individuals who came in contact with Tumat Met, with a dead corpse. We also later learn about the tragic death of Miriam and Aharon, both the sister and brother of Moshe Rabbeinu. And also we learn about Moshe's disobedience to Hashem's command, in which God told him to speak to the rock and not strike the rock when it came down to the people thirsting for water. We also learn another interesting aspect of this Torah portion about the creation of the Nachash Nechoshet, which is known as the bronze, or some would like to translate as copper serpent. And we learn there that Moshe created this serpent in order to heal anybody who was bitten from the serpent. Not just a serpent, but the serpent. That's what the Torah says, and we'll get to that in a minute to learn what that definite article Ha-Nachash means. And eventually, the end of the Torah portion, it focuses on the Jewish people defeating Sichon, the king of the Amorites, after he attempted to go to war with them. And so, God willing, we're going to learn how the juxtaposition of these events, how they're connected, and how they teach us a powerful lesson. Over in Masechet Gittin, as well as is brought down in Yerushalmi, I believe in Masechet Megillah, Chazal explained that the mitzvah of Parah Adumah was revealed to Moshe when Hashem gave the command to build the Mishkan. And we find this here in Gittin 60a. Rav Levi said 8 sections were said on that day that the Mishkan was erected. It says on the 1st of Nisan, these are, and it corresponds to Leviticus 21, and verses 1 all the way through chapter 22 to verse 26. The section of the Kohanim, the section of the Levites, corresponding to Numbers 8:5 through 26. Also the section of the impure, Leviticus 13, 1 through 14:57. The section of sending away the impure, Numbers 5, 1 through 4. And the section beginning with the words Achrei Mot, after the death. So in other words, the whole concept of dealing with Yom Kippur, brought down Leviticus 16. And it goes on to say, after the section dealing with the Kohanim who had become intoxicated with wine, Leviticus 10, 11 through 8 through 11, that's Parashat Shmini. The section of the Menorah, that's Bahal Otecha, Numbers 8, 1 through 7. The section of the Parah Adumah, which is this week's Torah portion, chapter 19, as all of these sections are necessary for service in the Mishkan. Now Rashi, in his commentary to Parashat Beshalach, he mentioned that the Parah Adumah was originally taught to Moshe at the waters of Marah. Okay, that is the episode when Moshe was originally commanded to strike the rock, versus in this week's Torah portion, he was commanded to speak the rock. And it was back then, Rashi says, that Moshe was shown the mitzvah of Parah Adumah. Rashi says here, at Marah, he gave him a few sections of the Torah in order that they might engage in the study thereof. Meaning the sections containing the command regarding Shabbat, the Parah Adumah, red heifer, also the administration of justice. And Rashi bases this off of the Mechilta, okay, and also we find this in Masechet Sanhedrin 56b as well. Now this is interesting, because if this is true, that Moshe was shown the mitzvah of Parah Adumah back in Beshalach, why didn't the Torah mention the mitzvah of Parah Adumah flat out? Okay, back in, let's say, any of those parshiot after Beshalach, like Parashat Tumah, Parashat Tzav, Parashat Shmini, Parashat Tzazriya, and Metzorah. And the reason why I ask that is that those parshiot deal specifically with Tumah Tahara. Those are the sections of the Torah that we learn about the impervious energy of what we call pure and impure. So why didn't the Torah mention it then and there? Over in Parashat Emor, the Torah warned the Kohanim, since that is a Sidra or Torah portion directly spoken to the Kohanim, it gave a warning, La nefesh lo yitama be'amav, that a Kohen shall not defile themselves for a specific soul. They should not come in contact to a specific soul. In other words, a dead corpse, and that's brought down back in Yehezqel Leviticus 21:1. And likewise, in Parashat Naso, the Torah warned that a Nazir, an Israelite, whether it was a male or a female, who took on a vow of consecration for at least a minimum of 30 days based upon the Mishnah, that individual shall al nefesh met lo yavo. They shall not come near to a dead person, as is brought down in Numbers 6:6. So while Emor and Naso mention Tumat Met, it's referred to not coming in contact with a dead corpse. Those parshiot do not explain the intrinsic quality of what we call Tumat Met. The Torah introduces Tumat Met once again as a chok. It's a decree, and a decree is something that defies logical understanding. When introducing Tumat Met as a chok, the Torah did not say this is the Torah of the one who is tameh, impure, via coming in contact with something that is nevela, which is usually an animal. It could be a consecrated animal or a pure animal to be consumed, to be eaten, or whether it's for a korban. It's something that develops an impurity within it. It's nevela. It did not say that. It doesn't say this is the Torah concerning one becomes tameh if they're a zav or a zava, if it's a female. And a zav or zava is essentially a discharge of the body. And there's an entire category to get into, and that really deals with the subject taharat hamishpacha, laws of family purity, which actually go back to Parashat Tazriah. Okay? Nor did the Torah say a person is tameh via sara'at, right? And that's the three different mutations that a person's skin would undergo before they became considered a mitzorah or a mitzorat, right? Torah did not say that. Rather, in this week's Torah portion, we see here in Numbers 19:14, it says, Zot HaTorah. This is the Torah. This is the instruction. Adam ki yamut be'ohel. When a man dies in a tent, in a house, you could say, right? Kol haba'el ha'ohel v'cho asher ba'ohel yitama shivat yamim. All that come into that tent, into that area, and all that is in the tent, this also includes furniture, okay, shall be impure for 7 days. So Tumat Met is different from other sources of Tumah. Much different. Another area where Tumat Met differs from other forms of Tumah is the process of purification, which I was just alluding to here in the beginning of the teaching. In other cases, on contracting Tumah, the individual purified himself in a mikveh, a living source of water. However, one who contracts Tumah via Tumat Met, they are required to not only immerse themselves in the mikveh, but they are required to be sprinkled by the waters of purification on the third and seventh day of the 7 days that they are impure. We see here in Numbers 19:12. It says, he shall purify himself. Hu yit chatbo bayom hashlishi uvayom hashvi'i yithar. On the third day and on the 7th day he shall become pure. Yet, the Torah says, v'im lo, if he does not purify himself on Hashlishli, the 3rd day, then he will not become pure on Hashvi'i, on the 7th day. So the individual who goes through this process of purification must follow the letter of the law. Now, when the Torah speaks about the purification process of one who is Tumat Met, it's alluding to what I would like to call the metaphysical uniqueness of man. What do I mean? Well, the difference between the two cleansing methods, immersion in a mikveh and being sprinkled with waters of purification, symbolize two different experiences. Immersion is done by the person who requires cleansing, while sprinkling is done by someone else. The person who contracted Tumat Met cannot purify himself by his own efforts. And this also kind of goes back to what we see with Pesach Sheni, the second Passover that's observed in the month of Iyar, regarding the men that the Torah tells us were unable to keep the first time Pesach rolled around in Nisan because they came in contact with a dead corpse. And the reason why they had to wait is because essentially the mitzvah, Parah Adumah, did not come yet in existence. However, one of the things I taught about that teaching there is that due to the genuine desire and compassion of these individual men who contracted Tumah via Tumat Met outside of their control, that their yearning of observing the mitzvah of Pesach created a second chance, a Pesach Sheni, which essentially brought in the mitzvah of Parah Adumah that did not exist at that time, which is mind-blowing. So what we see here is that the person who contracts Tumat Met, they can't purify themselves by their own efforts. A human being defiles himself and therefore must cleanse himself. Immersion, which symbolizes human freedom, creativity, capability, and initiative, is an important example of bechira, of free will. Sprinkling is the antithesis of immersion. The individual who contracted Tumat Met cannot sprinkle the cleansing waters upon themselves. It's not permitted. We see here in the Torah, Numbers 19:19. It mentions over here, and I think it's on the screen. I have it in the thing there. There we go. Numbers 19, Bamidbar 19:19. Excuse the technical difficulties there. It says over here, V'hizah hatahor el hatema. The one who is pure must perform the sprinkling upon the one who is impure. In other words, when it comes to Tumat Met, one cannot simply purify himself via a mikveh. He must be purified by another source. In other words, through one who is pure. Now, in Masechet Yomah, it's reported over there that Rabbi Akiva equates the process of teshuvah with purity, with taharot. And there, Rabbi Akiva used the mikveh as a metaphor for Hashem. In other words, just as a mikveh cleanses those who have become impure, likewise Hashem cleanses the Jewish people. And we find here in Masechet Yoma 85b, it says, Amar Rabbi Akiva, Ashrechem Israel lifnei mi atem mitaharein mi mitahar etchem avichim shebashamayim. Rabbi Akiva says, how fortunate, how happy are you, O Israel? Before whom were you purified? And who purifies you? Well, it's your Father in heaven. As it states there in Ezekiel chapter 36, 25, V'sacharti alechem mayim tehorim, and I will sprinkle purifying water upon you, and you shall be purified. And likewise it says in Jeremiah 17:13, that just as a mikvah, a ritual bath, purifies the impure, likewise HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the Holy One, blessed be He, purifies Israel. So it's a unique play on words that Rabbi Akiva is doing over here, also with the quotation from the passage of Jeremiah. According to Rabbi Akiva, teshuvah presupposes both methods. The initiative lies with the transgressor. In other words, if the transgressor is too arrogant to admit that he sinned, if he cannot bow his head and bend his knee to immerse himself into the mikveh, then he cannot do true shuvah, a shuvah shlema. If the transgressor takes the initiative, then God will complete the following act of teshuvah or purification. Now, previously, the Torah mentioned other sources that can make one tameh were contracting tumah, let's say, sheretz, which is consumption of impure insects, nevela, which again is a defect in a animal carcass, zav or zava, which is an emission, whether it's a male or female, a discharge of the body. Tumat Met, however, exists as an independent category. How, let's say, is it that if a person comes in contact with nevela, he does not contract Tumat Met, but if he comes in contact with a human corpse, he contracts Tumat Met? And this is the interesting thing, because nevela, essentially, it's an animal, and in most cases, biblically speaking, it refers to one that's mutar, one that is permissible to consume, or one that was used for a korban. The only difference is if it had a mum, a defect in it, okay, whether it got torn, let's say a treifa, or in Yiddish is called treif, or obviously in kosher food, but a treifa is what categorizes something as nevela. That if one comes in contact with that, right, just let's say by a couple feet away, they don't contract, it's not considered Tumat Met. But if they enter a room in which a human corpse was, they can contract Tumat Met. I mean, how is that possible? I mean, if we think about this logically, is not a dead body or a dead carcass if we were to think of that type of reasoning? Well, while a human corpse is subject to decay, just like an animal corpse, there is a difference between the two. In the animal kingdom, death simply destroys the functionality of the organism. However, the death of a human being is not only physical, there is a spiritual dimension as well. It ends the existence of an individual who is driven by vision and hope, who experiences joy and also sadness. When a human dies, an individual who is capable of creating worlds is gone forever, at least nifter from this lower reality, if you will. Human death constitutes the destruction of a world, not just a person. The most tragic experience of a human being is to know that after this person's death, they cannot continue serving Hashem. In Masechet Ketubot, we read about the story of Rav Yehuda Hanasi, that when he was on his deathbed, he was crying. And one of his disciples asked him, "Rabbi, why are you crying?" And the rabbi responded, and he said that when I depart from this world, I will no longer be able to serve Hashem via the mitzvot of the Torah. Not be able to do it any longer. In fact, we have the quote here, Ketubot 103b. It says, Rav Yehuda said to him, "I'm crying for the Torah and the mitzvot that I will be unable to fulfill after I die." Now, according to Rav Yehuda Hanasi, the eternal bliss of what we call Olam Haba cannot compare to the Avodah Hashem, the service of God in this world. And from this Talmudic passage, we learn a dichotomy between the human and animal world. Unlike the animal world, in which the individual animal exists only as a representative of a species, if the species survives, the individual death is not a tragedy. Life goes on. However, for human beings who merit the Shekhinah, and I have to say this in a very narrow way, merit the Shekhinah, which means I'm limiting the broad view of individuals who fall in line amongst the Jewish people, or those who are spiritually refined. I'm not speaking about the entire world, which include all the nations who live animalistic because they don't merit the Shekhinah, which means they could tend to be more aligned with the species of the animal kingdom, tragically. But for those who merit the Shekhinah, and who is a microcosm of creation, death is an existential tragedy. Back in 1973, prior to the Yom Kippur War, the Prime Minister of Romania at that time, Nicolae Ceausescu, he visited the Prime Minister of Egypt, who at the time was Anwar Sadat. And the purpose of this trip was to warn the Prime Minister of Egypt not to go to war with the Jewish people, simply because the Israeli army was vastly superior to the Egyptian army. And Prime Minister Sadat, he acknowledged that the Israelis were vastly superior. However, he informed the Prime Minister of Romania that he found a secret to defeating the Jews. And so Prime Minister Sadat then takes out an Israeli newspaper and he shows the Prime Minister of Romania how the entire nation of Israel mourned over the death of one soldier. Prime Minister Sadat then said to Prime Minister Ceausescu, "A nation like this cannot survive a war of attrition for long. If every individual is so dear to them, and if they continue to mourn for each of their fallen as deeply as this article and picture indicates, they will lose the war no matter how superior their weaponry may be." Well, contrary to Prime Minister Sadat's wisdom, he was dead wrong. In Israel, the urge to save a life takes precedence over every consideration. In other words, when one Jew dies, it's as if an entire world collapses. Therefore, Tumat Met is not the result of the death of the body, but the departure of the soul. And the Torah teaches Israel's one nephesh, one soul. They are not described fragmented and decompartmentalized like the other nations described in the Torah. And you can see this dichotomy between the genealogy of Esav and the genealogy of Yaakov. Esav is described decompartmentalized, what Yaakov is described as one soul. And so what we see here It is a response to human helplessness, which is a traumatic existential experience. When humans accept the selfish philosophy of, let's say, Anwar Sadat, they are very much like the animal kingdom. And to such people, Shlomo HaMelech says, there is no difference then between a human and an animal. They share the same fate. Kohelet, Ecclesiastes 3:19, Ki mirei v'nei ha'adam u'mirei ha'behema, the fate of humans and the fate of animals are u'mirei echa lahem, the same thing. They're the same. Tumat Met represents the tragedy of the human condition, from which no man can escape. Tumat Met requires an outside source, in this case, HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Isaiah spoke about the day when Hashem would eradicate Tumat Met forever. It says in Isaiah 25, verse 8. It says that he will bilah hamavet lenetzach, eliminate death forever. Hashem Elohim will wipe tears away from all kol panim, all faces. Mankind alone cannot defeat death. Hashem is the one who must complete that task. And so the great mystery of death, which man cannot comprehend, is considered a chok, is considered a decree. It's something that's not logical whatsoever. We turn here to Numbers 19:14, in which it says, Zoha Torah, Adam ki yamut be'ohel. This is the Torah, the instruction, when a man dies in the tent. The corpse of one who dies renders everyone else impure, not because they experienced something wicked, but because they suffered a trauma. The only way to become pure is by becoming pure through one who is pure. Once again, in this case, this is the illogical decree of this mitzvah. Someone contracts Tumat Met, nothing, basically malicious on that, on their part, they contracted it. But how do they get out of this position of limbo now? Well, they have to go to one who is pure, in this case the Kohen, hatahor hatema. Therefore, he must go to the one who is pure to purify, tema, the one who is impure. And then the one who is pure that makes one, sprinkles the one who is impure, that pure one becomes impure again, himself, which doesn't make sense. But there's a rhyme to the reason for that. The Yehezqel in his commentary to this week's Torah portion explained that the origins of Tumat Met go all the way back from the primordial serpent, back in the story of Gad Eden, in which the Nachash injected Chava and Adam with what's called Zuhama. Zuhama is like a venom, in this case, not a physical venom, but an energy, a spiritual impurity. The Zuhama, Chava, was then passed down to every human being. This impurity is the source of our mortality, which clings to our body in the grave. And the reason why human beings must die is that through death, the body goes through the process of decaying. And as the body decays, the power of the Zuhama is removed from the body. However, as the Ramchal teaches in Derech Hashem, this process of decomposition differs between those who are righteous and those who are wicked. That a person who is more wicked, more earthly, more materialistic, the death process is a painful process that they go through. And eventually, even in transitions into death, the soul's departure from the body, the residual energy of it leaving, is a very painful experience. And therefore, it's a slower decay process for that individual, where to the righteous, it's almost like taking an eyelash. If it fell in a cup of milk, it comes out real easily, right? Versus if you put it in a cup of coffee and you're sliding your finger around trying to get the thing out, or soda or something, it comes right out, right? And the decaying process is quicker. And so when the time for Olam Haba comes, the body, if you will, or the soul in this case, will experience a tachiyah. Now we translate it as resurrection, but it's an immortality, in which the soul becomes completely free of the Zuhama. The Yehezqel's comment, a tracing Tumat Met to the primordial serpent in Gad Eden, is also related to the bronze serpent that is mentioned in this week's Torah portion. Now, the Torah tells us that when a person is bitten by not a serpent, but Hanachash, the serpent, he will then look upon this Nachash Nechoshek, this bronze serpent, for a healing. We turn here to Bamidbar, Numbers 21, verse 9. It says, Vayaz Moshe Nechash Nechoshek. Moshe made a bronze serpent, and he placed it on Al Hanes, a pole. V'haya in nashach, and it would happen to be if Hanachash, not a serpent, but the serpent, bites at ish, a man, then that man will v'hibit el nachash, look upon the bronze hanechoshech, v'chaya, and he shall live. He shall contemplate, look upon it, and shall live. Now, the language of the Torah is very interesting because, once again, the Torah is the same if a man is bit by a serpent, but by ha-nachash, the serpent. Definite article, meaning that this is a known serpent. And the reference to the serpent is none other than a reference to the primordial serpent that is mentioned in Gad Eden. Furthermore, another interesting feature that sticks out with this whole bronze serpent creation is that if you pay close attention to the language, you'll see that originally Hashem commanded Moshe to create a saraf, a fiery serpent, not a bronze serpent. Go back here to Numbers 21, verse 8. Vayomer Adonai o Moshe, Hashem said to Moshe, Aseh lecha saraf. Make for yourself a saraf. A saraf is basically a venomous snake. All right? So for those of us here in the Western world, you know, things like rattlesnakes, diamondbacks, etc., anything that's venomous, that's what a saraf is. Vesimoto al nes. And you shall place a saraf on a pole. And what shall happen? V'chaya kol hanashuch. And it shall be that anyone that was bitten by the saraf, v'ra'a oto v'chaya, will look upon it, and he shall live. Okay, so the language is the same, but why did Moshe make a bronze serpent when Hashem originally commanded him to make a fiery serpent? What's going on with that? Well, B'ezras Hashem, with God's help, we'll address the answer to this question in part 2 of this teaching. Now, juxtaposed to the mitzvah of Parah Adumah is Israel's entry into the wilderness of Zin. Numbers 20, verse 1. It says over here, Vayavo'u v'nei Israel kol ha'eda midbar Zin. The children of Israel and the entire assembly arrived in the wilderness of Zin. Now, I know this is, by the way, in English it says Zin with a Z, like it's the letter Zayin, but in Hebrew it's the letter Sadi, which is a TS. Sin, okay? That's how it's properly pronounced. But anyway, so we see something interesting here. And we have to ask the question, why is the mitzvah of Parah Adumah juxtaposed to the wilderness of sin? Well, it was in the wilderness of sin that Miriam died, in which she became Nifter. And we go right here to Numbers 20, verse 1. It says, Vatamat Sham, Miriam Vatikaver Sham. Miriam died there and she was buried there. Fascinating. Between the episode of Korach and the death of Miriam, there is a gap of 38 years. The Torah does not mention anything happening during those 38 years. The Torah's silence on the 38 years between the episode of Korach and Miriam's death reveals a disturbing tragedy about the human condition. Later on in Parashat Devarim, when Moshe is going over the journeys of the Jewish people, specifically addressing the newer generation that is going to enter into Eretz Israel, Moshe refers to the mysterious 38 years by mentioning how the people, the former generation, simply traveled the wilderness until they died. And we read this in Deuteronomy chapter 1, verse 45 through 46, and then also chapter 2, verse 1. And he says over there, Vatashuvu, and then you return, and then you also cry Lifnei Adonai before Hashem. V'lo shema Adonai b'kol lechem. But however, Hashem did not listen to your voice. He did not listen v'lo ha'ezin alechem, to you. And therefore, you dwelled in Kadesh, okay, Yamim Rabim, for many days. And you settled there, Yishaftem, settled, like a permanent residence is what that means. And then this is afterwards, we turn, V'nefen v'nisa, Hamibara derech Yamsu. Very interesting. we turned and we journeyed to the wilderness towards the Yam Suf. The seer reads, in other words, the original entry point of the Jews from out of Eretz Mitzrayim to when the Kiryat Yam Suf, the sea split, Moshe and the people went back to that original entry point. And that's fascinating. Keep that in mind. I'll come back to that later. Okay? And that's where they went back to. As what? The Ber Adonai, it says, Elav, as Hashem commanded me. And what did we do afterwards? Vanasav et Har Seir. We circled Seir, Yamim Rabim, for many days, the region of Edom, which is also interesting because that deals with the klipa of Esav, which is not just, it's a state of mind per se. But this is a fascinating passage here. The Torah describes the journey as an aimless form of wandering without any purpose whatsoever. And we go on over here to Deuteronomy 2, 14 through 17. And it says, the days, v'hayamim asher hachenu, that we travel from Kadesh Barnea until we cross the Zeret Brook. How were they? They were Shaloshim Ushmoneh Shana Ad Tom Kol Hador. 38 years until the end of the entire generation. That's the generation Hashem said would not enter into Eretz HaKodesh because they believed the evil report of the emissaries of Israel when they went on their tour of the land for 40 days or 40 nights. And it says afterwards, Anshe HaMilchama, and the men of war from the midst of the camp as Hashem swore to them. That's the tribal leaders that went to do their tour of the land, not the reconnaissance mission as falsely misunderstood. And it says, even the hand of Hashem was on them to confound them from the midst of the camp until their end. That's interesting. Wow, that's pretty fascinating. A little revelation there I'm just catching, which will tie into what I'm going to say here towards the end. That even the hand of Hashem was on them to confound them in the midst until their end. As if Hashem allowed them to self-sabotage themselves, is what the Torah is saying. So it was afterwards that the men of war finished dying from amidst the people. And it says, as Hashem spoke to me, saying. Very interesting passage. These 38 years were known as a time in Hebrew that's called Hester Panim, the concealing of God's face. It was an era of spiritual decay and a lack of accomplishment. The Jewish people were completely alienated from God, and there was no communication whatsoever. I know when you pick up a Chumash and you're going through these Torah portions, you think it's action-packed from one page to the next. But however, what you don't realize is that between the narratives that we're reading here, and even the repetition of the Torah later in Devarim, really, you're only seeing 2 years of action from the Yetziat, the exiting of Egypt, to Har Sinai, which is a 50-day journey, basically episode. And then you had the Egel Zahav, a little dramatic experience there with this idolatrous, bachelor party. And eventually Hashem forgives, rescinds any curses against the Jews, and then says, okay, let's renew the covenant, etc. And then eventually what we see here is that once God tries to show the people something and their unbeliefs, they throw it in God's face, say, hey, let's go back to Mitzrayim. We're better off on food stamps, the Section 8 welfare there in the ghettos of Mitzrayim. And eventually, instead of going on, God paid for their vacation for 40 days and 40 nights. They get able to go check out the land, bring some of the resources back. They speak a lie, and Hashem says, you know what? Ravlach, enough of this. You guys drop dead in the wilderness. And so, from that point on, the next 38 years, there's nothing. It may look like it when you read the Chumash, but according to what we just read here in Deuteronomy, there was no communication between Hashem and Israel. And what's crazy about this is that in Masechet Tanit, Chazal described a very disturbing practice that the Jewish people did on every 9th of Av, every Tisha B'Av, because that is the original date the spies came back and cursed the land, which is also the tragic day on which both temples were destroyed, the Bayit Rishon and Bayit Sheni, and also a bunch of other tragedies that have befallen the Jewish people in those days. And Chazal mentioned that since Hashem decreed that the first generation that came from out of Mitzrayim was to die in the wilderness. The sages teach that the people would then dig graves, actual graves, and lie down in these graves on the 9th of Av. And they said some would actually mamash, they would die, while others would then arise on the 10th of Av, only to wander the wilderness for another year and repeat that same process in the very next of Av. And we find this at Tanit 30b to Tosafot. It says here, every year, on the 9th of the month of Av, they would dig their graves and lie in them. In the morning, the announcement was made, let the living separate from those who had died during the night. The year that the decree was rescinded, they all rose and thought that they erred in the calculation of the month till they saw the full moon. Then knowing that the decree had been rescinded, and they held a celebration. The curse is over, the 40 years have passed. Now this passage portrays a very disturbing picture that upon hearing the decree that the generation who emerged from Mitzrayim were to die in the wilderness, the people accepted defeat and they waited until the day they died. This is disturbing. In other words, these people lived a life with no hope, with no aspiration, with no joy, with no energy, with no future. Nobody engaged Hashem in prayer. That's why Moshe, when he talks about the history, 38 years of Hester Panim. And so to them, existence seemed irrational. They were simply living to die. Living to die. And the irony in all of this is that even after Hashem made the original decree that first generation that emerged from Israel should die in the wilderness, their carcasses shall drop here, the strange thing about that is that we do read after, the Torah then introduced the laws, the mitzvah, achala, and wine libations. Let's go back there to Numbers chapter 15, verse 17 through 21. It says over here, Vaydaber Adonai el Moshe lemor, Hashem spoke to Moshe and he said, Daber b'nei Yisrael v'alamata alechem. Speak to the children of Israel and say to them, now read this closely, read this slowly. God already just made a gezerah, decree. Your carcass shall drop dead in this wilderness. But then he says to Moshe, here Moshe, I have two more mitzvot to give you. Bevoachem, mazeh, bevoachem el haaretz. When you come, literally when you enter the land, asher ani, mevi echem shama, that I bring you, it shall be that you will eat the bread of the land, v'haya be'al techem, be'al chalchem, melechem ha'aretz. You're going to eat the bread of the land, and then you shall what? You shall tarimu teruma Adonai, set a truma, a portion aside for Hashem. That's the mitzvah chala. Reshit, and as for the first of your kneading, you shall set aside a loaf as a portion, like the portion of the threshing floor, so that you shall set aside for your first of your kneading, shall you give a portion to Hashem for what? Ledorotechem, for your generations. But I thought Hashem just made a decree that the people were to drop dead in the wilderness. This is strange. If God made a decree that they should die, why is God over here issuing new mitzvot? Oh yeah, when you come to the land. What do you mean when you come to the land? If Hashem issued a decree of death, why would he issue a mitzvah that the people will not be able to fulfill? Yeah, the second generation, they will fulfill it, right? But why just utter that later, right? Make that command later. The reason why Hashem gave the mitzvah chala, and eventually libations, after he made the so-called decree, was to convey a message to hope. Hashem was trying to teach the people to believe in themselves and also in him. In other words, this is a valuable lesson we're learning here. Life may have many setbacks due to our shortcomings, but that does not mean that all hope is lost. I, in my personal belief, in my opinion, believe that if the people would have desired to make it to the land of Israel, they would have generated the strength and chutzpah, just like Moshe did when he engaged Hashem in prayer after the Egel Zahav episode, in which he forgave the people, and Hashem in return would have allowed the children of Israel to enter the land. But what happened? The people first and foremost, did not believe in themselves. They didn't believe in themselves, let alone have faith in Hashem. They had no confidence. They had no self-esteem. They accepted defeat, and they just withered away in the background of life, waiting to die. Very sad. And it describes a lot of people in this world. And the Torah tells us that the dark period of the wilderness came to an end in the 40th year with what? With the death of Miriam. It was at this point of time that the Torah then introduced Parah Adumah to deal with the topic of Tumat Met. And what's the significance? Well, Chazal, they make an interesting statement in Moed Katan, that the juxtaposition of Miriam's death with the Parah Adumah is the teachers, just as the Parah Adumah offers a covering, a kapara, a atonement, so does the death of the righteous do an atonement. We see here Moed Katan 28a. And it says over here, Lama nismecha mitat Miriam leparashat Parah Adumah. Why is the death of Miriam juxtaposed to Parah Adumah? Oh, lomarlach, this is to teach that just as ma Parah Adumah mekaperet, just as the death of the Parah Adumah brings an atonement, af mitatan shel tzedikim mekaperet. Likewise, so does the death of the righteous bring atonement. Now, I'm going to say something here. It may offend some people. But people tend to look upon these rabbinic quotations as theological talking points to justify their belief systems in certain righteous individuals that they believe are Mashiach figures or whatever. And they say, well, this person's death atones for me. And we see this in Christianity. And people will resort to trying to go through the words of Chazal to find this, and people have no clue on what they're quoting. No clue. And I already dealt with this topic in great detail, the topic of misuse of rabbinical writings when it comes to the death of the righteous. I have a teaching on that you go find, okay? And you can learn about it, because this concept was developed. It wasn't always a concept or belief that the Jewish people had maintained. It was something that developed, especially with the advent of Roman persecution, okay? When the Romans tried to outlaw Judaism in the Torah, and they wanted the Jews to venerate the Roman emperor, the half-man, half-god figure over in Madre Italia, or Rome at the time. And so to fight against them, obviously the Jews would not, and they would continue to venerate Hashem and his mitzvot, the Torah. And so that would lead to persecution and the assassination, the crucifixion of many Jews, such as Rabbi Akiva, the attempted killings of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, who was able to hide in a cave. There's many others, right? The 10 righteous martyrs who died. So I have a whole teaching on that, to learn that in context. Now, when we learn about the death of Miriam being juxtaposed to the Parah Adumah, which once again deals with Tumat Met, in the 40th year, we need to understand that the purification process of using the ashes from the Parah Adumah was only effective when an impure person was sprinkled by a pure person. So contextually, in relation to being purified from Tumat Met, a person was not considered pure unless they were sprinkled, as the Torah says, on the 3rd and 7th day. And if they didn't get sprinkled on the 3rd day, then they weren't purified on the 7th day. Now, a Chazal comment upon this juxtaposition of Miriam's death with the Parah Adumah, saying that just as the Parah Adumah brings atonement, likewise shel tzadikim mechaperet, the death of the righteous bring atonement, they are telling us that we are not able to benefit from the death of the righteous unless we imitate their personal conduct. Okay? That's what that means. That we're not making a theological statement that many people have taken their words out of context to mean. How many of us think that the death of this Sadiq or that Sadiq or whatever, Sadeket if it's a woman, was permitted so we can live a life that we want to live, right? In other words, in this situation with the Jewish people, as Chazal say that every 9th of Av they would dig a grave and lie down in it, waiting till die, until the 40 years were over. How many people may have benefited from the acts of a righteous person only to live their life in a proverbial grave? The primary function of the death of the righteous is to allow us to experience the purification of Hashem, to enable us to ascend from the graves that we have descended into. And even though this concept was something developed by Chazal, when Rome started persecuting many of the teachers of the Torah thousands of years ago, it still was a benefit to the people, because instead of the people being led like lambs to the slaughter, it was actually the leaders that took the actual brunt of the actual slaughtering. And so in exchange, you got one person versus a nation being killed off, even though there was a massive onslaught with the Jewish revolt against Rome, leading to the destruction of the temple. Still, if Rome could get their hands on the influences of the Torah, then you could calm the waters of people having an uprising against the Roman government, which means that you don't have so much Torah being transmitted. And so if a person benefited from that righteous person's death, it was meant for them to learn to imitate that individual in their life, in their family, in their communities. And so how many of us are truly benefiting from, let's say, the death of the righteous? And there's many things that you could say about that today, all right? You could take a look at, I'll give an example. Let's say the movement of Chabad, even though I'm not a Chabadnik, don't always agree with Chabad's philosophy or hashkafa, but one of the things that you see them doing is they take the words of the Rebbe and they go and establish Chabad houses around the world trying to reach Jews. There has to be somewhere out there, and I've read many and I've heard testimonies of Jews who were secular, somewhere in some far dome in the country out there, ran into a Chabad house, and this brought them back to the Torah. And clearly they give everything in the merit of the Rebbe. That even though the Rebbe died, right? He didn't die a martyr's death per se, but he died. And his death is what led to the inspiration of many to bring people back to the source of the Torah. And so some people would give this testimony that so-and-so's death inspired me. And this could even be through people who are not even alive. They read a commentary or a book, something that speaks to them. It changes their life. And so the Talmud statement about the death of the righteous bringing atonement, once again, has nothing to do with theology. It has to do with application. So how do I know someone is truly benefiting from the death of the righteous? It's how a person imitates them. So with that said, as we come to an end for part one of this teaching on Parashat Chuqat, the tragedy of the human condition, we have to ask ourselves the question, are any of us suffering in our proverbial grave? Do we have genuine joy? Do we have hope? How is our communication with our Father in heaven? Are we content? Are we disciplined? Are we committed? Are we obedient? Do we have confidence? Do we even believe in ourselves? Do we have high esteem, or do we have low self-esteem? And so I'd like to challenge you, because there are many people who have simply been living life only to die. Get up, they go through the emotions, or go to work, go to school, whatever it is. And a lot of people are facing economic challenges today. There's uncertainty in the world. People are looking for Superman figures to save them, political super figures, superhuman figures, whatever. Someone's looking for someone to save them. And yet, we all need to look to our Father in heaven and look sometimes within. Have we been wandering the desert of life? Right? Are we laying down our proverbial graves? We may have had some setbacks, right? That happens. But do we see that Hashem also has a promise for us? A land to enter, figuratively speaking. I'm not just talking about Mamash, Medinat Israel, the actual nation or the state of Israel. I'm talking about a person's purpose in this world. Have you entered there yet? Or are you allowing yourself to experience a setback because of your unbelief from something? And yet Hashem is trying to show you to go forward. And this is the challenge that the Torah is bringing to us in this week's Torah portion. Unless we engage Hashem to fight for the promise that He has placed before us, tragically our lives will wither away in the background of life, only to be the name of a headstone in the cemetery, Chasas Chalila. And there's dozens and dozens of names on the headstones in the cemetery, forgotten to the pages of history, just like the first generation that came out of Mitzrayim. And so as we take a look at this week's Torah portion, what the Torah is trying to teach us, the Torah is challenging us to continue to persevere and press through. Persevere and press through. God willing, in part 2, I will come back to the concept of the death of Miriam, but the Parah Adumah, and also learn about the Nachash, the serpent, and what that all means. and concept with Siddiqui. We'll learn how all this is woven together beautifully to teach us a very valuable lesson. And so with that said, Chavarina will bring us to an end for part 1 of our teaching on Parashat Chuqat. Once again, if our organization is a blessing to you and you'd like to donate, you can find a link to donate directly below the video. We thank you in advance for your financial support. It allows us to continue to produce these teachings. And also, if you have any questions pertaining to this Torah portion, feel free to send me an email. I will answer those in the order that they arrive in. Until next time, Chavarim, may the God of Avraham, Yitzhak, and Yaakov bless you and your family. Shalom and Kol Tov.